He had traveled across deserts and survived monsters, but the thing that stopped him was a castle with a sign above the gate. No one who enters here ever returns. The prince had been given a direct order by his king: go to the Bath Bogard, the castle of non-existence, and find out what happens inside it. On the road, every person he met told him the same thing: no one returns. Turn back. The warnings came from strangers, from travelers, from people who had lost someone they loved to the place. He listened to each of them, thanked them, and kept walking. Not because he was reckless, because the order had been given and he was the kind of man who follows through. At the gate, a barber with a mirror received him and led him into a round bath. The moment he stepped into the water, a thunderous noise broke out. Complete darkness. The barber was gone, and slowly, the water began to rise. He swam in circles in the dark. The walls were close. There was no light to see by and no sound except the water. The level climbed past his chest, past his chin, past the point where he could touch the floor. He did not know how deep the room was below him or how high the ceiling was above. There was only the dark and the water and the fact that it was still rising. When the water reached the top of the cupola and he had nowhere left to go, his hand found a stone at the center of the ceiling arch. He grabbed it. Another thunderous noise, and then he was standing alone in a desert. That is the shape of a genuine choice. Not a crossroads with neat signs pointing in different directions. Not a spreadsheet where you can weigh the options in daylight. The real ones happen in the dark, with the water rising, when the part of you that functions like a nervous manager, the part that counts pros and cons, reads the room, keeps a running tally of what could go wrong, has run completely out of moves. That part of you, the deliberating ego, was built for a certain kind of problem, the kind with information and time and the possibility of more research. It was not built for this. The trouble is that every person who has developed the capacity to think about their own thinking eventually ends up in the bath. This is not a punishment. It is the precise cost of being conscious. When instinct ran the show, there were no choices, only movements. The animal does not agonize over which berry to eat. The bird does not lie awake wondering whether to fly south. But we traded that clean, unquestioning guidance for something else: the ability to hold multiple futures in mind at once and choose between them. And in that trade, we also got doubt and regret, and the agonizing sense that the wrong choice will cost us everything we left behind. The stone statues in the garden around the castle, the circle of people who had entered before him and never returned, were not weak. They were people who stood at exactly the same threshold and could not move. Freezing when the water is rising is its own kind of choice. It just isn't yours anymore. What made him reach for that stone? What made him reach was not knowledge of what the stone would do. It was not confidence that reaching was the right move. It was something simpler and more fundamental. He was out of options. The water was at his mouth, and he reached. The stone statues in the garden around the castle had something different. They had frozen before the water reached the top. They had found a way to stop, some decision not to decide, some retreat into the certainty that waiting would eventually produce safety. And in that stopping, they had become exactly what they most feared becoming: permanently fixed, beautiful, immovable, and gone. This is the pattern underneath every genuine choice anyone has ever had to make. Here is what it cost us to become the kind of creatures who can deliberate. Instinct is immediate. It does not pause to weigh outcomes. The bird that senses a storm does not compose a list of reasons to fly south. It flies because the impulse and the action are still one thing. There is no gap between the knowing and the moving, but somewhere in the long history of the human animal, that gap opened. We became capable of standing between the impulse and the action and asking, is this right? Is there a better option? What happens if I'm wrong? And in that opening, that extraordinary, terrifying space, everything we call civilization was built. Every poem, every law, every regret. Consciousness, understood this way, is not the solution to the problem of choosing. It is the source of the problem. The deliberating part of you, what you might think of as the ego, the nervous manager who cannot stop calling meetings, who keeps a mental spreadsheet of pros and cons and consequences, is not a malfunction. It is the unavoidable result of being awake to your own situation. and it is genuinely useful for a certain class of problem, the ones with good information, manageable stakes, and time to think. For those problems, more analysis does improve the outcome. But there is another class of problem entirely, and the deliberating manager is precisely the wrong tool for it. The wrong tool problem is this: every genuine choice requires giving up the other paths. Not metaphorically, actually. The person who says yes to medicine really does bury the musician. The person who chooses to stay in the city really does lose the person they would have been in the mountains. This loss is real, and the part of you that makes spreadsheets knows it perfectly well. That is why it refuses to stop running the calculations. As long as the analysis is still in progress, no path has to die. The loop of deliberation is, among other things, a way of staying in the garden of all possible futures without committing to any of them. But here is what careful observation of actual human decisions, the important ones, the ones that shaped lives, keeps showing. The part of you that deliberately weighs options is genuinely the last to know. The outcome was already in motion. The unconscious part of you, the enormous record-keeping operation that runs beneath everything you're consciously aware of, the part that has been watching this whole situation from the beginning, that noticed every signal your deliberating mind was too busy to register, kept in a language you cannot read, but your body already speaks. That part was already oriented, already moving. This is not mysticism. Intuition, for example, is perception via the unconscious. It is the entire history of everything you have ever learned and felt and noticed, compressed into a first impression that arrives before the analysis begins. Memory, too, operates through the unconscious in ways that are far more complex and far less under deliberate control than we like to believe. The decisions you remember having made carefully were, in many cases, already decided before you sat down to think. The deliberating part came in afterward and provided the reasoning. This is not a reason to stop thinking. It is a reason to understand what thinking is for. The deliberating manager has a real job, but it is not the job of running the show. The collaboration works like this. When the deliberating and the deeper are aligned, when what the ego has decided and what the deeper current is already carrying are pointed in the same direction, the choice comes with a kind of ease that feels almost unearned. And when they are opposed, when the ego insists on one thing and the deeper current is pulling another way, something else happens, and it is not usually pleasant, and it is usually instructive. The unconscious is compensatory. When you lean too hard in one direction, when the deliberating manager has spent 3 years insisting on a particular outcome, the deeper current flows the other way, quietly restoring what was being ignored, sometimes through dreams, sometimes through a sudden collapse of the thing you were insisting on, sometimes through a feeling in the chest that precedes the thought by half a second. So what exactly is the deliberating part of you supposed to do? The deliberating part of you is supposed to participate, not lead. And that distinction matters enormously, because there is a category of choice for which participation is exactly right, and a different category for which it has to step back and let something larger move through it. The first category is the one we usually talk about when we talk about making decisions. Choices where more information helps, where precedent is useful, where you can consult someone who has been here before and take their answer. Those choices benefit from deliberation. They can be improved by analysis, but they are not the hard ones. The hard ones are different in kind, not just in degree. They are conflicts of duty, situations where two genuine obligations collide, where honoring one means violating the other, where there is no move that doesn't cost something real. The law stops here. Precedent stops here. The rulebook has no entry for this specific combination of circumstances. No outside authority can settle it, because the only person who carries both of these obligations is you. What happens in a genuine conflict of duty is this. The deliberating manager runs its process, identifies the options, weighs them, runs the analysis, and arrives at a place where the calculation genuinely does not resolve. Both sides are real. Both losses are real. The loop continues. And if the loop continues long enough without resolution, something else happens. An inner authority, deeper and older than anything the deliberating manager has access to, puts an end to it by creating a fait accompli. The instinctive tendencies assert themselves. The decision arrives, not through deliberation, through something that operates the way a force of nature operates. Afterward, the deliberating mind tends to retroactively claim it chose. This is almost always partly fiction. The more accurate account is, the deeper part moved first, and the deliberating part provided the justification afterward. We do this because the alternative, acknowledging that we did not fully choose, offends something in us. There is a deep human conviction that the self must be the author of its own decisions, and admitting that something older and less visible was already in motion feels like a loss of dignity. It is not. It is a description of how the system actually works. In the most extreme cases, the ones where two irreconcilable obligations have both been fully honored and neither will release, the deliberating ego does not just step back. It is suspended. It is held, quite literally, between two things that cannot both be true, and it suffers. This suspension is not a phase to get through quickly. It is the necessary condition for what comes next. There is an image that captures this precisely. The figure hung between two thieves, one of whom goes to paradise, one to perdition. Both paths are real. Both outcomes are real. The figure in the middle is not choosing between them in the ordinary sense. The figure in the middle is holding both, consciously, without flinching from either. And in that holding, something else is happening. The opposites are being contained rather than collapsed. And what gets produced in that containing is not available through any other method. This is why a woman who cannot make a choice she knows she has to make might find herself projecting the capacity to decide onto an interior figure, a bold, adventurous version of herself she experiences almost as a separate character. This figure is not a delusion. It is the part of her that already knows what she is moving toward. The archetypal pattern, wired into the deep structure of the mind, not personal or private, but shared across the entire species the way all mammals share a spine, activates when the deliberating mind refuses to follow what the instincts are already pointing toward. And that interior figure must eventually fall, because the courage and decisiveness it holds are not its own. They are hers. They are the energy she put there because she wasn't ready to carry it herself. When the projection collapses, when the fantasy hero is finally wounded, all of that energy returns to her. The deliberating mind, which had been paralyzed, suddenly finds that it has what it needed all along. The mechanism, then, is not analyze, decide, act. It is tension accumulates, deliberation runs out, something deeper moves. And the role of the deliberating part in a genuine conflict of duty is not to produce the answer. It is to hold the tension long enough, with enough honesty about both sides, that the deeper answer can arise. How do you know when you're holding the tension genuinely, and when you're just using waiting as a more sophisticated name for avoidance? The difference is in the question you keep returning to. If the question you keep turning over is about approval, whether people will understand the choice, whether it will look defensible, whether you can justify it afterward, that is the deliberating manager trying to reduce the situation to a question it can answer. Approval is a manageable variable. Approval has precedent. Approval can be researched. And if that is the question at the center of your loop, then you are not waiting for an answer to arrive. You are waiting for an alibi. The genuine question feels different. It has a quality of east to it. Not a direction you chose, but a direction you recognize. The way a person who has been wandering knows, at a certain moment, not which direction they should go, but which direction they are already facing. The first move, then, is to stop amplifying the analysis and start listening to what is already there. At the bottom of most genuine dilemmas, something already knows. Not every detail, not the fully formed answer, but the direction. The inner voice that carries this is quiet, not because it is weak, but because the noise of the deliberating manager, all the catastrophizing and imagining of consequences and performing of futures for imagined audiences, drowns it completely. The practice is not to manufacture an answer. It is to reduce the noise enough that what was already there can be heard. The second move is to trust the first impression before the analysis begins. There is a moment, sometimes lasting only a second, before the deliberation activates, when you simply feel what is right. Not sentiment, not wishful thinking. What might be called quick knowing wisdom, the immediate awareness that carries the whole sum of your experience. Everything you have ever noticed about this kind of situation, compressed into a single apprehension that arrives faster than thought. Scientists have reported solving problems in dreams. Mathematicians have seen the proof appear whole without working through it. These are the dramatic versions of something that happens to everyone, in a quieter register, at the moment before the meeting of the nervous manager gets called to order. That first impression is data. Treat it with the same seriousness you would give to any piece of information that matters. The third move is to wait for the third option. When you are genuinely caught between two paths that both carry real weight, not a case where one is clearly better and you are just frightened, but a true conflict where both losses are real, do not force the choice between them. Hold both, actively, not passively. Keep both obligations in full view simultaneously. What the inner life is capable of producing, when the tension is maintained without collapsing either side, is something that neither option contained. Not a compromise, not a splitting of the difference, something genuinely new. The deeper organizing center, not the version of you that answers emails and makes schedules, but the one that knows which direction is east, the one that carries your whole life form and not just your current plan. That part of you can produce a resolution the deliberating manager would never have arrived at through its own effort, but it needs the tension to be real. If you let one side win early, the third option never appears. The fourth move is to read the indirect signals. The deeper center does not communicate through spreadsheets. It communicates through images that arise unexpectedly, through the sudden clarity that comes after a long walk, through the moment an outer event mirrors your inner question so precisely that dismissing it as coincidence requires more effort than taking it seriously. When the world seems to have been reading the very question you were too afraid to ask. It communicates through what the wise figure at the crossroads says in a dream, not telling you what to choose, but asking you the question that forces you to know. These signals are not manufactured by will. Your job is only to notice them and to treat them as real information rather than noise. The deeper organizing center apparently wants the deliberating part to make a free choice. It does not announce the answer and wait for you to comply. There is a reason the Zen cowherd watches his ox with a stick so it does not graze on other people's meadows. Not because the ox is wrong to graze, but because the cowherd's specific ox must stay on the specific path that belongs to it. The shoe that fits one person pinches another. There is no universal recipe. There is only the irrational life form that is specifically yours, and the work of learning to recognize it. The failure mode, the thing that looks like waiting but is actually avoidance, is staying in the loop because the loop feels safer than the choice. As long as the analysis is still in progress, no path has to die, but the water is still rising. A young woman once drew a picture of where she was. Not a picture of the choice she was facing. Not a picture of either of the two men pulling her in different directions. A picture of herself, or rather of what was happening inside her. A circle with a doubled center, behind a cool blue star, fire breaking out. Beside it, a sun beginning to emerge, still forming, blood vessels running through it, not yet fully itself, fire and sun side by side. Something old and cold alongside something new and warm, both present at once, neither winning. That picture was not a description of a problem. It was a description of a process. The circle she drew was the image the inner life produces when something is genuinely underway, not resolved, not collapsed into a single answer, but held. And what the drawing captured, without her knowing it consciously, was that she was already becoming whole. The conflict was not the obstacle to the answer. The conflict was the path to it. Later, the answer arrived through a dream, and it did not come in the form she expected. The two men she couldn't choose between appeared in the dream, not as lovers, but as film producers, and she was the one with the leading role. The conflict dissolved because the dream showed her what the conflict had always been concealing. It was never about choosing between them. It was an artificial problem, like an animal unable to choose between two identical piles of food because it has not yet understood it isn't hungry for either. What she actually wanted was herself. The conflict between the two men had been the water rising in the dark room, forcing her to reach for something she had not known she was reaching for. This is the answer to the question that opened everything. What if I make the wrong choice? You might. The person who publishes the work they know will end their most important friendship might be wrong about many of the things they claim. They will certainly be wrong about some. And yet, they knew before they sent it that they had to send it. The deliberating part of them ran its process, found the probable cost, and reported it accurately. And then the deeper current moved anyway, not in defiance of that knowledge, but inclusive of it. The cost was known. The work went out. What you become in the act of choosing genuinely, not the choice that makes you look good, not the choice you could defend in public, but the choice that answers the question of which direction is east for you, cannot be undone by being wrong about some of the details. The deliberating manager will never be able to guarantee the outcome. That was never its job. Its job was to participate honestly in a process that it does not, in the end, control. Our conscious mind is not the whole of our human nature. It is and remains only a part. There is something larger, and that something larger is what has the final word. He reached up in the dark water and grabbed the only thing he could reach. He did not know what it would do. He grabbed it anyway. That act, reaching in the dark for something solid when you cannot see what is above you or below, is the definition of a genuine choice. Not certainty, not knowledge of the outcome, just the willingness to reach, because the alternative is to become one more stone figure in a beautiful garden, perfectly preserved, permanently still.